I mean, first it begins, obviously, in my family with the mother and father. And my father, it was kind of interesting. People would come to Arizona for lots of reasons, and his family came because of health, and people would move to the sunshine in the dry desert, particularly with the health challenge of his mother. And to put this in perspective, I mean, this was the turn of the past century around statehood. Terrible health challenge. And so as a young guy growing up in Arizona, he actually lost his father and had to raise, a couple young sisters. So here's a guy, 16 years old, and yet his mother was so ill all the time, and then losing a mother. I only tell you that because when I think back, so what was it about whatever influence there was on me and knowing, because I didn't know my grandparents, particularly on that side of the family, and I only knew my other side while I was a young boy, maybe through middle school or something. But I tell you that because there was, first, always an ethic of getting involved in the community, but it was a curious, not conflict, conundrum, because on the one hand, my father's influence was always be self-reliant. Don't lean on anybody for anything. This is because that's what he had to do. I mean, it was very difficult when you're poor and it's hard. And now I tell you that because here was the other side. So there was that. You're on your own. Do your thing. Don't whine. Blah blah blah. That was my family, my sibling. That's how we were raised, with a mother that sort of supported that ethos. But then at the same time, he was surrounded with nonprofit organizations in his life, growing up as a young, difficult family situation. I mean, everything from scouting and civic clubs and social service agencies. And so the weird part for me was, this intersection of, well, if you don't lean on anybody for anything and you work hard and you just do your own thing, that doesn't exactly speak to getting involved in the nonprofit social sector, right? But then on the other hand, it was the very social sector that, and I don't think I'm dramatically making the point, saved him, saved his family, and saved his life, really. And so always engaged and involved in community work, board work, and other work, right? And so for me, that's kind of what you did. Now, fast forward, Vietnam War, I was a young guy, I had a draft number. The de-escalation of the war was happening, so unlike my older brothers that, one goes off to boot camp, everything's go time before the de-escalation. I began as a volunteer, as a kid, in a Red Cross, I was 14 years old at the time in a chapter, and that was when they embraced young people as volunteers, as youth involved, and very engaged. I later in life not only worked professionally, but then I became a volunteer. That was that national thing I did as a volunteer that took me to meet Russ Mobby and the whole Michigan connection in that role. But my point is, I was hugely impacted at age 14 working at a military hospital when Vietnam-era vets were coming back wounded. And remember specifically in a hospital room, and here's what's weird about this. Today, kids my age would never be, it wouldn't happen. You would not be allowed. We weren't old enough. There would be liability. You couldn't do it. But back then, we did it. And so this guy who was wounded, he had a body cast on in a contorted position that to this day I still can't figure out. They were doing like skin grafts and I don't know what all. Kind of took me under his wing, taught me to play chess, at his bedside, had a lot of lessons about the world, and I'm just a kid. That was enormously, and I don't have time to get into the whole story, but that was enormously influential. And so for me, from that point forward, so I was a young high school kid, for me that locked me into the idea of service and career, and literally worked my way through college, professionally working in the Red Cross. I mean, I went from a kid volunteer to working at the chapter, and they had a little part-time job, and boom. So I started very young. But it was that, I always think back to that weird mixed message of self-reliant, don't lean on anybody, pull yourself up by your, blah, blah. That was the ethic of work. But then it was up against this realization that if it weren't for the social sector, I wouldn't probably be here, because I don't believe my dad would have made it. He wouldn't have met my mom, and on it goes. So that's the short, early story.